Good evening. I'm Ediss Gandelman, co-chair of Temple Beth Elohim's Racial Justice Initiative, and with my co-chair, Sherry Kassirer, welcome you all to tonight's quarterly meeting. Our hot topic tonight, what the racial wealth gap looks like today and what you can do about it, promises to be one of the highlights of our 2020 events, and hopefully will whet your appetite to join the RJI in upcoming educational programs, advocacy efforts, and partnership activities. As you'll hear from tonight's panelists, economic justice is a cornerstone of achieving racial equity and racial justice, and is an important priority for the Racial Justice Initiative. Tonight's format will follow how many of our TBE programs are structured. You as audience participants will be muted, and the chat box can be used to write your questions and observations to the panelists and moderator. I will introduce our distinguished panelists and our moderator, Alan Solomont, after Rabbi Sherman offers welcoming remarks. Alan will then orchestrate discussion with our guest speakers, and then we'll begin to answer your questions that have been recorded in the chat box. Finally, we hope you'll all remain with us after the panel discussion for a brief RJI business meeting. We promise not to review the 3-page quarterly update report sent to you on Saturday, but Sherry does have some exciting announcements to share in about 15 minutes post-panel. So without further ado, let me invite Rabbi Sherman to speak some words of wisdom. As many of you may know or do know, all of our clergy are deeply involved in the work of racial justice, but Rabbi Sherman has been exceptionally engaged, leading one of our civil rights groups last November and participating in the Partakers College Behind Bars program at MCI Concord. Rabbi Sherman.
Thank you, Ediss. I just want to make sure before we begin, if everybody could please make sure that you are muted, that would be wonderful. I see there are a few of you who are not, so if you could do that, that would be great. It is truly, thank you, Ediss and Sherry. It is so wonderful to see so many of you here tonight for this important conversation. And so on behalf of our entire clergy team, I want to welcome you all and welcome to our panelists. Thank you for being here this evening to teach us, to move us, and to really inspire us towards action. But before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge great sadness in our community this evening upon learning of the sudden passing of our beloved community member, Rebecca Cohen. For Rebecca's presence was truly felt in so many places in our community, from Shabbat services to the Tikkun Olam table. She was truly a big part of our mental health and racial justice initiatives. And she was just a really great person and friend to so many. And so amidst this darkened time, I know I'm saddened by her passing. And I know that this community holds each other tightly in these moments. And so I hope that we can dedicate our study to her blessed memory and to light up the world for good in the way that she could light up a single room with her smile and her warmth, even on Zoom. And so let's just take a moment. For so many of us, I'm truly proud of the work of our Racial Justice Initiative. I'm thankful for our leaders and their commitment to justice, equality, and creating opportunities for us to learn about and within our blind spots. And so tonight we come together to explore what the racial wealth gap looks like today, as our program description matter-of-factly states. One of the starkest legacies of slavery is the persistent and ever-increasing wealth disparities between Black and white Americans. In 1915, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan taught, "We are not born free and equal, but we are born to become free and equal." It is the goal of all social endeavor to bring about equality in the inequality into which people are born. It is the goal of the spiritual endeavor to make humanity free This is not easy work, but it's work that must be done. Our holiday of Hanukkah, which will begin on Thursday night, teaches us that amidst a great and complex challenge, courage and a commitment to bringing light and lighting candles, even in darkness, still has the capacity to illuminate the world around us. See, the racial wealth gap demands our moral imagination to come up with ways to break down and dismantle the systemic racism and issues that have brought us to this moment in this conversation. And so I'm grateful to our panel, already leaders in this work. Thank you for all you are doing, and we look forward to understanding how we can further partner with you. So thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to the pages of our community for being here, and I'll pass it back to Ediss.
Thank you, Rabbi Sherman. Let me now introduce our three panelists. Quincy Miller is the president of Eastern Bank and its parent, Eastern Bank Shares. Eastern Bank is a full-service commercial and retail bank with $14 billion in total assets and over 100 banking and insurance locations serving communities in Eastern Mass, Southern and Coastal New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Formerly the president of Citizens Bank, Massachusetts, Quincy has stayed true to lessons learned through his experiences in consumer banking, where he developed his passion for leading from the front line, ensuring that his perspective is guided by colleagues with diverse backgrounds and experience. As you may have read in last week's Boston Globe headline story, Quincy is one of the 19 founders of the new Commonwealth Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund that just made its first grants to 20 deserving nonprofit organizations to make transformative societal changes by addressing systemic racism and racial inequality. Dr. Karilyn Crockett has the distinction of serving as the City of Boston's first ever Chief of Equity. This is a cabinet level position established by Mayor Walsh to embed equity and racial justice into all city planning and operations. Charged with dismantling racism by putting an intentional focus on supporting communities of color and marginalized groups across all city departments, Karilyn's office facilitates cross-departmental collaboration as well as partnerships with community residents, nonprofit organizations, and business leaders. Her extensive background in urban studies and planning showcased in her book, People Before Highways, as well as her experiences as Director of Economic Policy and Research and Director of Small Business Development for the City of Boston, have prepared her well for this critically important position as Boston's Chief of Equity. Segun Idowu currently serves as the Executive Director for the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, or BECMA. Under Segun's leadership, BECMA has established itself as one of the premier voices in advocating for and directing resources to Black-owned businesses, and has been particularly effective in reaching out to those businesses impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. BECMA annually hosts the Mass Black Expo, the theme of which this past November was reimagining Black Wall Street, a gloriously successful virtual gathering of thousands. Segun is the consummate builder of partnerships, including a relatively new one with JALSA, the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action. The Solidarity Consortium encourages synagogues to establish new business relationships that fulfill both business needs and social justice goals, and TBE is on the way to becoming part of the Solidarity Consortium. And now let me introduce our moderator for this evening, Alan Solomont, no stranger to our congregation, as he and his wife Susan are longstanding members of TBE. Alan is currently the Dean of the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University, a position he assumed after he completed his service as ambassador to Spain during the Obama administration. Before his posting to Spain, Alan chaired the bipartisan board of directors of the Corporation for National and Community Service, the federal agency that oversees domestic service programs, including AmeriCorps, Learn and Serve America, Vista, and Senior Corps. Life before these political appointments centered on a professional career in health and elder care services. With his partner, Susan Bayless, Alan built a network of elder care facilities in New England, co-founded Houseworks, a home care company that helps seniors remain independent, and was the founder and managing director of Angel Healthcare Investors. The best item on this illustrious resume, however, is Alan's passion and compassion in caring about underserved communities, his commitment to Tikkun Olam, and the ultimate mensch. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Alan?
Thank you, Ediss. That was an introduction that would have made my mother proud. But my real claim to fame is being married to the wonderful Susan Solomont, who just came into the room and told me to smile. I'll try. I want to start by thanking Ediss Gandelman and Sherry Kassira for being co-chairs of TBE's Racial Justice Initiative. I also want to say how honored I am to be here with Rabbi Sherman, and how humbled I am to be moderating this conversation with these three Bostonians who are really doing the work of trying to cure this most malignant problem that we face. I am going to hopefully lead a conversation for the next 35 or so minutes. I was going to try to ask each of the panelists individual questions, but since they each come at this from different perspectives, from the public sector, from the nonprofit sector, and the business sector, I may be asking more questions of each of them than I might have. After our conversation, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And if people would like to ask a question, type it into the chat box at any time. And then when we begin to take questions, our hosts will serve those questions up to me and I'll ask them on your behalf. Please make your questions brief so we can give the most amount of time to our panelists to answer. And let me also say how proud I am to be part of a congregation and a community that makes these issues such a priority. It really is a source of pride for me and my family. So let's start the conversation. One way we describe inequality is by citing statistics. In Harvard professor Bob Putnam's latest book, Upswing, which I recommend to all, he teaches us that 1% of American households now own 40% of the nation's entire household wealth. That the 1%, the share of the 1% has nearly doubled since the 1980s, and the top 0.1% of American families hold 20% of household wealth. The most widely cited statistic about the racial wealth gap in Boston is a 2015 report by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston that concluded that the median net worth of white households in Greater Boston is $247,500, and the median net worth of non-immigrant African-American households is $8. That's right, $247,500 is an average net worth of white families. $8 is the average net worth of Black families. I'd like to begin the conversation by asking each of our panelists to put a human face on this injustice and to describe the racial wealth gap in our own city of Boston, other than by those numbers. So would each of you give us an example of how this gross disparity in wealth manifests itself in the lives of individuals and families in Greater Boston, and educate us about how extensive a problem it is? Karilyn, would you start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Alan, and thanks to all of our hosts and conveners. Rabbi Sherman, thank you for your prophetic word and this powerful ministry and this powerful faith community that has assembled us today. Sherry and Ediss, thank you for just making this space. And it's just really wonderful to be at such a thought-provoking event, even on a Monday, chilly Monday night where we can just really drop anchor into the issues that matter and that are really weighing on our hearts. So Alan has asked just out the gate to kind of think about how to put a face on some of these numbers and how to illustrate just the enormous magnitude of what it means to be living in a racial wealth gap that is not decreasing but increasing. And so in my role as chief of equity for the city, I have called out the racial wealth gap as a centering set of ideas and a centering work for my portfolio. So this is an especially meaningful event for me. It is also meaningful because this number of $8 as the median uh, net worth or the median wealth of a Black family is poignant for me because I come to you as a daughter of one of these $8 families. And so I was born and raised in the city of Boston. My family comes to Boston in the 1950s, late 50s from West Virginia, where my family's, my great grandfather and my grandfather were coal miners. And when the mines were mechanized in the 50s, left there, Excelsior, West Virginia, and traveled to Boston, the north, the so-called promised land. But when they got here, they found not the promised land, but even a more devastating condition. So my family came to Boston seeking economic opportunity through jobs and education, but for the most part, they did not find that at all. It has been a continuous struggle for my own family and a very telling tale of downward mobility. And so even as we think about the American dream and the myth of meritocracy and all these things, I find that in my own family story, is all of that is really challenged. And so when I think about what it means to actually sit in the city of Boston, which represents probably the greatest educational capital in our country, the home of the most outstanding healthcare system in the world, and yet the disparities of families like mine is stark and real. And so some of what we're trying to do in the city is think about what are the tools, what are the policies, what are the things that government can do to right some of these wrongs. I was fortunate. I came through Boston Public Schools. Was fortunate to actually get a decent education for high school, was recruited to private school, and that really opened up the door for me to be able to pursue college and then grad school and all of these things. And so I do remember the struggle it was for my own family to try to imagine what a new possibility could be for my cousins and I, the first generation of our family born in the North, and what it meant to live in a post-industrial situation where prosperity was not guaranteed to us. And so for my family to try to think about how they could still stay the course for us was definitely a lesson in grit and fortitude. But again, my family is not exceptional in that. When I look at the 700,000 people who live in the city of Boston and the 20%, 22% of that population, which is Black, native born Blacks, the struggle is very real. And so when we talk about what it means to address systemic racism, what it means to make a way for generational prosperity and wealth building, we have to start with the fact that the story of systemic racism, again, has got to be rooted out across the city, and government is a good place to start.
Thank you, Karilyn. Segun, could you talk about how extensive a problem this is in the city of Boston, this racial wealth gap?
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to repeat the thank yous that Dr. Crockett shared for all who helped to put this together and have this conversation, which is important, with an eye towards solutions and how to address it and how to work together to do that. That's the most important thing. It doesn't happen often, so I appreciate that framing of this conversation. When I think about how extensive the racial wealth gap is in a city that, like Dr. Crockett, I grew up in, I think of the fact that almost 70% of the people that live in Roxbury are renting, to your point about home ownership earlier. I think about the number of Boston Public School students who go hungry and the percentage of them that are Black and come from communities of color. And then, of course, in the role that I'm in, I think of the fact that in a statistic that we initially helped to get published of the city of Boston itself doing 1% of its spending with minority businesses in just 2018, knowing that in years past, it has never really gone above that, and only recently is now starting to trend a little bit upward. And so for me, it's just a history of repeated injuries. The fact that, again, as Dr. Crockett said, there are many of us who live and grew up in this city where a story like Dr. Crockett's is not unfamiliar. And if it's not something that was experienced by one of us, we know 10 others that did experience it. And it's no better, when traveling to other parts of the Commonwealth of the country. So at the end of the day, it's deep rooted. It's why we call it systemic racism, because it's present not only in the daily experiences of African Americans or those in the diaspora in Boston, but also present in our institutions that continue to keep us in those conditions. And again, that's why it's important for these conversations to happen, because each of us who are here tonight plays some role in transforming those systems so that a year from now, if it were up to me tomorrow, we could be sharing a different story, a different picture. So we're not repeating, these same conditions and these same stories. So at the end of the day, myself, Dr. Crockett, Quincy will share a whole bunch of statistics and stories tonight. They won't be much different. But again, I know all of us are eager to work together on those solutions.
I do want to get to solutions, but I also want to talk a little bit about the why and the causes. But let me ask Quincy to just comment on an example that he might cite, how this racial wealth gap affects the lives of individuals and families.
Great. Thanks, Alan. And again, echo the thanks for tonight, and particularly to the over 100 people who've joined on a Monday night to have this conversation. That means a lot. And so, really what we're going to spend tonight talking about is really the interconnectivity of how all these things create this, wealth gap in Greater Boston, right? You've heard about, some of those things already, but it goes into policing and the criminal justice system. And the impact that that's had on families throughout generations. The health system, right? We have one of the greatest healthcare systems in the country here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because it's not just Boston, it's across all of our communities. And if you're a person of color, you have these same impacts no matter where you live. But the challenge is, you can see the death rate for COVID and the impact of communities of color that's had. Segun's going to talk a lot about the economic aspects and how that ties into businesses and housing. But one that I think is really stark, particularly again for the Commonwealth, is we have the #1 education system in America. Massachusetts is the #1 education system in the entire country. In K through 12, and arguably in the universities as well. But K through 12 is not even an argument. But yet here in the Commonwealth, 1 in 3 Black and Latino students, less than 1 out of every 3 Black and Latino 4th graders are actually on the appropriate reading level for 4th grade. That continues. Only about 28% of 8th graders, low-income 8th graders, are actually on the appropriate math reading level. And then you get the whole way to high school, and then you look at less than 1 in 3 Black and Latino students who take the SATs meet college readiness benchmarks in both math and reading, compared to 2/3 of their white peers. And so when you put all of these things together, and then you layer on the impact, which I know we're going to talk about, of generational wealth, you can see how you end up with $8, right? And you can see, even for a Latino family where that number's roughly $1,700, you can see that impact, because that impact hasn't happened just on that family. It's happened on generations that have led to this point.
Maybe you could expand on that, but in this context, Quincy, how is it that in the wealthiest country in the world, in one of the wealthiest cities in the country, that the distribution of wealth is so unequal? And why does it seem to perpetuate itself? And I'll ask you first, and then I'm going to go to, actually, we should be on a first name basis if it's okay with Karilyn Crockett. Okay, Segun? Or we should all, whatever's comfortable, but I did, anyhow, Quincy.
Yeah, so I'm going to take, again, because that we could spend the next hour just on that one single question there, but I'm going to expand on the education piece, because so often, and I'm going to try to tie in this idea of generational wealth and then turn it over to my co-panelists here. But so often, and I completely agree with this comment, is that, education can unlock, financial success for, people of color. I'm the first person to graduate from college in my family, and I can say that absolutely enabled me not only to change my financial outlook, but to change the financial outlook of my entire family. And so, but that in of itself is one of the challenges, because if you look at the average wealth of a white high school graduate compared to a person of color who has graduated college. So the high school graduate versus the college graduate, there's been lots of statistics out there that have shown that college graduate actually has less wealth. And people sometimes have wrongly pointed to that and say, well, see, college degrees don't make a difference. But what they don't realize is that for many of those students of color who have graduated college and now have gotten that, good job, a nice paying job, they're not only taking care of themselves, but like me, there's, the house that my mother lives in is a house that I bought for her. So many students of color, after they graduate college, they're also helping other family members. And so that, by nature reduces that individual person's wealth. And so I just give that as an example of just one thing that drives a wealth disparity. And that's on the most educated people who had an opportunity, not like so many of those examples I gave from the education system failing our students, to actually go to college and get an education.
Segun, what is it about the city of Boston that can't seem to do better in dealing with this injustice?
I'm smiling because it's a fun question. And like Quincy said, we could, well, he's right. We could be here talking about this for an hour, but it could be just one of us talking about this for an hour and then the next person talking about it for an hour. And I will say, yes, I call her Karilyn all the time, but I could feel my grandmother, my 94-year-old grandmother, pulling at my ear for not putting the doctor there on an auspicious occasion like this. So I'll start off by saying this. One of the issues with Boston in particular is we are very, very much into symbolism and not substance. And so, at least for the time that I've grown up here, our goal, from what I realize, or at least from my perspective, has always been not to overcome systemic racism, but to appear not to be racist, which is two different things. And so everything we have done has sort of been surface level. It's been whatever makes us look good, because we're trying to push back against the image of the city from the 70s and the 80s, whether it be busing or other, Charles Stewart, et cetera. So that's part of the problem, is the lack of commitment to addressing the issue head on. The second piece of it is, the rabbi brought up chattel slavery in his opening remarks, and he was absolutely right to call out and point out that that's the part of the genesis of the issue, although we can go back even further than that to talk about where the seeds of today's gaps and disparities are. But it's also the steps that even up here in the good old progressive North that we took to exclude people, from particularly African Americans, but really non-white people, from enjoying the riches and prosperity of the nation, whether it be through housing covenants, where folks were saying you can't sell to non-white residents, whether it be to, anyway, a lot of it focuses on housing. On the educational piece, in the modern day, Quincy's right about education being able to unlock potential and access to wealth. But there's a report that just came out last year that talked about how Black students in particular, how Black families are actually suffering because of going to college, because we are in more debt than other families because of that low, because we have little wealth. And so we're taking on more loans, which is, and the job market is becoming difficult to take to pay off. And so this $1 trillion loan debt for students is impacting the Black community far worse than others. So all these things combined, and again, of course, I'll focus on the business aspect and the fact that we have less access to startup capital, we have less access to contract opportunities, less access to investment, et cetera. All of these things combined, bring about where we are today, particularly in the city of Boston, but in the greater Boston area as well.
You mentioned restrictions on selling housing. It wasn't too long ago that right here in Wellesley, where our beloved temple sits, that there were restrictions on the ability of folks to sell to Black families. But Karilyn, I want to ask one more question about cause, if I may, and this may be a little provocative. Bill Gates has a net worth of $119 billion. Elon Musk's net worth is $135 billion. Jeff Bezos is worth almost $190 billion. During the pandemic, US billionaires saw their net worth rise by almost $1 trillion between March and October, while millions of Americans lost their jobs, went hungry and homeless. What, in your view, is the connection between a relative few Americans having so much and so many Americans having so little? Is it just a matter of fairness, or is there more of a direct cause and effect relationship?
I think somehow we have decided that this is not shocking. Somehow we have decided that this is okay because someone has earned the right to something and someone else has not earned the right to live or the right to have access to adequate housing or healthcare or food. So we still have not agreed that that is not okay as a nation, as a society. And until we get super clear on that, you're gonna have an even longer list of stats to read through, Alan. I'll tell you this, that when I started by saying sort of this fact that my own family struggle continues and persists, I don't care who's a millionaire or billionaire. I'm still trying to figure out how so many of us, and particularly Black and brown folks and people of color, cannot get not only secure, but not even get access to the idea that your dreams, your hopes, and your aspirations can dictate your future. And so this isn't just about wealth in terms of money in the bank, but wealth in terms of a sense of yourself, your own value, your sense of possibility. Those are the things that are also being eroded as we talk about the racial wealth gap. And Quincy was absolutely right in talking about the fact that there, inside of these statistics, sits this unbelievable paradox. And the paradox is that the racially based gulf in wealth accumulation widens as income increases for Black and brown people. So the idea that, as Quincy was saying, that the demands on the income or the wealth you're able to generate if you get access to a better job or education is completely diminished because of the additional demands on transfers to family members, to relatives, the additional burden of really high debt to income ratios, and the fact that that folks are not even able to really save in the way that they could to allow for a generational wealth transfer to happen. That's the issue here. I know that when I was applying to college in high school, I remember being so proud to put on my financial aid form, the FAFSA form, that my family and my grandma who raised me at the time, that we had $50 in the bank, because to my 17-year-old mind, this was showing that we had a cushion. And I felt so proud to be able to write that down because it felt like we were taking care of business. Now to say that, it seems absurd to know that in my application to Yale, that this is what I was saying we had as an asset. Luckily, we were able to make that happen through a lot of financial aid and just faith and prayer for sure. But again, it illustrates to me how serious the situation is when we have families who are living in such a precarious precarious state. And we have very few moments where we call it out, and shock is what is registered. So when the mayor called out racism as a public health crisis in June of this summer, the force of that should not be lost on any of us. It is definitely not lost on me in terms of what it means to say that not only is racism a problem, but it is an emergency, a public health crisis, a toxin, and that we cannot be okay with that. This idea that we have decided that it is okay to organize our resources, our land, our assets based on race, and our entire society can be organized based on this hierarchy that puts so-called white people at the top and everyone else down at the bottom. How is it that we can just calmly sit and discuss something that should be as shocking and provocative and terrifying as we know it to be?
Let's talk about what we can do about it. So each of you works on this problem from a different angle. You each work on putting together the resources of different sectors: government, business, the nonprofit sector. So let me ask each of you what can be done by the sector that you work in. Let me start with Segun about looking at the business community. Segun, what can business do within the Black community, but within the larger business community? And tell us a little bit about the challenge that you have issued to the Boston business community to invest $1 billion in racial justice.
Happily. Well, a couple of things. First, it's important to understand the value and the role that Black businesses play in the broader economy. So everywhere I go, I'm always sure to share that according to the last census, the 2016 annual survey of entrepreneurs, it shows us that there are over 2,000 Black firms, which means that they employ full-time more than 2 people, who employ 14,000 Massachusetts residents and contribute billions of dollars to the tax base. Important to understand that and to be able to share that, because a lot of times we talk from a place of lack, what doesn't exist and things like that. But there's a healthy, we're growing. Of course, that was before COVID. And so, there are things we can talk about. The fact that, 11% of our businesses have reported closing their doors. We know that number is very low. We know that with the winter coming, that's nearing 20% of our businesses, if not more. So, to Karilyn's point about a state of emergency for systemic racism as well, it's also similar is true for the fact that our businesses are facing extinction, quite literally. And that should alarm everybody because of the fact that they play such a key role in the health of this economy that the governor prior to COVID could take credit for. So in terms of supporting our businesses, there is no lack of entrepreneurial spirit in our communities. From the day we first came here, we were coming up with different ideas, to transform our conditions. And so the way we help to continue to stimulate that and support it is by investing in those ideas and not setting up all these barriers that we have in place. Right now, trust is something that communities of color do not have from white communities in this country. Anytime there's an idea that has come up by one of us, so we want to move forward with the venture, we face a laundry list of questions and barriers to helping actualize those ideas versus people in the white community who want to start their idea. The best story to me is Adam Newman, founder of WeWork, who just walked in a room and had this crazy idea and got billions of dollars. But if a Black person, there is no Black Adam Newman. None of us could walk into a room and give half of an idea and get investment to do it. And I'm not also suggesting that should be the way we do things. But at the end of the day, we need to ensure that we're trusting Black leaders and Black ideas and investing in them, ensuring that we're connecting folks to startup capital that's going to help them catapult their ideas. But beyond just the grants or loans or lines of credit and other types of investment in our businesses, what's most important is that we're doing business with Black-owned businesses. Commerce is how we stabilize our businesses, and it's how we grow our businesses to ensure that we're employing more people, providing better wages, et cetera. And that's why we're happy to be working with JALSA on the Solidarity Consortium to ensure that the faith community is investing in our businesses. But finally on this, I'll end with the coalition work and stop my rant. back in June, after we all witnessed a lynching with George Floyd, I and many of my other colleagues got a number of phone calls from friends and colleagues in the white community asking, what can we do? How do we prevent not only that lynching from happening, but the fact that systemic racism is completely and utterly destroying our nation? And so, rather than saying, well, here's all the, the list of what BECMA wants and what we're pushing for, decided that I was going to bring together about over a dozen Black and Indigenous leaders, knowing that it's not just the Black experience or Black people that have suffered terrible tragedy here in the nation, but also Indigenous peoples. And so brought us together to come up and put on paper what should Massachusetts do. Because in Massachusetts, we like to absolve ourselves of the sin of slavery, not remembering the body of laws, body of liberties in 1690 that effectively became the first law in the books justifying slavery, the role that our merchants and shipbuilders played in bringing people from the continent of Africa here and profiting off of that wealth. Faneuil Hall is rightfully being brought up, and the role that Peter Faneuil played in the slave trade. So we are not absolved of sin in that terrible system. So what we did was put forward this call to the business community, nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, and state and local government, and came up with about 5 to 7 different things that these different sectors could begin to do to address systemic racism, knowing that 5 things are not the end-all, cure-all. It's going to take a lot more time to address 400 years of systemic racism, but this could begin the process. So for the business community, we framed it in a way of capital, culture, and who's in charge. And moving backwards, I'll just say that we know it's important that who's at the table. We know it's important who is at the table, and that these people be more than the directors or of diversity, but that we're also having access to the CEO, COO. It's not just important that we be on the boards, but that we be the presidents of these boards, on the executive committees on these boards. It's important that corporations and other companies are creating community for people of color, because Ayanna Stanley Jones and many others will show us that there's no such thing as a safe space for Black and brown bodies. And so we need the whole community to be affirming and uplifting for people of color. And finally, on the capital piece, back to this idea of investing in our communities, but this $1 billion fund, which, to be honest with you, there are many reports that say America owes, trillions of dollars to just Black people alone, and wouldn't even take into account people of color in general. So that $1 billion really is quite nothing. And for a place like Massachusetts, which is swimming in wealth compared to other states, it really is nothing. But our whole goal for raising that fund is to ensure that it is Black and Indigenous and brown people who are directing capital toward their communities, because at the end of the day, we know the way out. We're the ones that have been oppressed in this nation, and the ones who are able to show the rest of the nation the way toward freedom land. And so for us, that fund is a way to begin to ensure that we're investing properly in our communities, investing in housing, investing in our businesses, investing in alternative economic models, and finally ensuring that we're purchasing land. Because one of the other things when it comes to this wide disparity, this economic disparity, is the fact that if you look at the records in the country of how much land Black people owned 100 years ago, really, in the decades after slavery, we own millions and millions of acres of land more than we do today. That is troubling. And that is also a piece of why we see this growing economic divide. So that's the call that we've put out. And we're very proud of Quincy and all of the executives who started their fund and raised it from attempting to raise 20 million to 100 million. And of course, we're considering that part of the $1 billion fund because they are investing in our communities as well. It's Black and brown led. And of course, are supporting Karilyn in the racial justice fund that the mayor announced over the summer as well, because all of that at the end of the day, in conversation and in partnership, we're working to get money to the people that know what the problem is, which is the people who are experiencing it, because they know how best to see themselves toward freedom.
I think it's comforting to know that these different initiatives that you're working on are all working also sort of in lockstep together. But I did want to ask Quincy, who could talk about business as well and about what Eastern Bank is doing. And I commend you for the work that Eastern Bank is doing and the contribution, the commitment they've made. But you're also part of a fund that is putting money into the nonprofit sector. You just gave away it's the new Commonwealth Fund for Racial Equity and Social Justice. You just gave away your first $1 million to 20 nonprofit organizations, each of whom received $50,000. What do you believe the nonprofit sector can do in terms of dealing with this problem? Why did you choose to invest in that way, Quincy?
Yeah, so great question. So, well, like Segun shared, the nonprofits, and I'll talk a little bit about particularly Black and Brown led nonprofits who are on the ground. They're the ones who are on the ground making change each and every day. And so, similar to, what brought the coalition with Beckman together, but, back earlier this summer, after George Floyd's murder, a group of 19 Black and Brown corporate executives came together organically via chat and just said, we're in a moment right now where we have a responsibility to be able to give back and help lift up. B, corporations and individuals and white allies are asking us what do we need to do? To Karilyn's point, at least for my generation, this is the first time for my generation that we're having a conversation that's serious about trying to tackle and end the systemic racisms that exist. And so we came together, and one of the things as we were talking about what we wanted to do was to form this fund by Black and Brown leaders to invest in nonprofit organizations that were supporting Black and Brown communities across the Commonwealth. And that really was our focus. And what we learned and got as we dug into this even closer is, there's actually something called philanthropic redlining. And you may not know, but if, as Segun talks about the lack of resources for Black and Brown small business owners, et cetera, that he's working on, the same thing exists on nonprofits led by Black and Brown executive directors. They are 24% smaller than their counterparts in terms of revenues, and their unrestricted net assets are actually 76% smaller. It's harder. They don't get the benefit of the doubt. And I remember I was having this conversation, and I know he's on the line. I hope he doesn't mind because it was but I was having this conversation with Jeff Busgang when we first started, and I was sharing with him these stats. And Jeff, who's very close to a nonprofit led by an executive director of color, he said to me, Quincy, I see it in that nonprofit. I see the way that they're challenged more, they're asked more questions, they're not given the benefit of the doubt. And again, this is another one of those sort of the lack of a network or systemic things that makes it hard. And so our real focus has been around being able to, I think of the 20 organizations that we supported with this first $1 million, $50,000 each, 16 of the 20 were Black and Brown led with executive directors. And $50,000 to these organizations, when typically their average gift is probably a couple $100, is literally it completely alters their trajectory. And our goal is to be able to work and funnel money to nonprofits across the Commonwealth who are driving real change in their communities, and help them by giving them that lifeblood, be able to scale their organizations and, not just, execute that in Lawrence, but, take that same thing and be able to do it in Fall River or in Boston. And so that's really what our work is. And our work is not the 19 of us making the decisions on where that money needs to go. It is being connected with people on the ground, leaders, community advocates, those nonprofits on the ground, to say who's really making a difference. And as an organization like Eastern, for example, and I'm proud to work for one of the most philanthropic corporations in all of Massachusetts. But we're even thinking about how we can be more intentional now with our giving at Eastern. And you're hearing lots of foundations now because of the work we're doing at NCF and raising up the fact that these nonprofits have been left behind, is starting to think differently about how they put money out there on the street. So that's really what we're focused on. And we, back to things happening organically, we figured out pretty quick, the New Commonwealth Fund for Racial and Social Justice and Equity was too long of a name. So we just call it the New Commonwealth Fund now. But that's the work that we're doing.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Well, first of all, Rabbi Sherman tells me, or Phil Sherman tells me, that we're not getting a lot of questions in the chat room. I have lots more to ask, but I would like to open it up to the audience at some point. So I encourage people to put questions in the chat room. But usually when we talk about these issues, we start with government. And so I'm actually going to ask Karilyn to make the third comment about what can be done. What can government do and what should government do to narrow the racial wealth gap, Karilyn?
Well, first, we have to do the work of calling it out. And so again, this piece around calling out racism as a public health crisis and emergency is not a small thing. Boston is not the only city in the country to do this. Now, there have been a few folks who moved in this direction, but to call a thing is pretty important. Because what we're recognizing by doing that is that not only is racism a problem, but it is this deep sort of toxin, and its corrosive effects linger in this idea of doubt. And Quincy really spoke to this quite powerfully, that there's something about these other folks that you doubt, that you just don't quite believe. They seem like nice people, but you doubt their ability, their intelligence, their worthiness. And so calling out this way that racism causes sort of hesitation and doubt and disconnection is lethal. And in the context of government setting a table in terms of helping us understand what's important, what our values are, what our sense of true north should and can be, that is important work of naming and then creating structure to support that naming and support change. So when the mayor then calls out this role of chief of equity and an equity and inclusion cabinet, that's also signaling structural change. All of this is so essential in this moment of pandemic that we're in. COVID has taught us so much about what else we are doing and what we're not doing. And so many of the policies and provisions that government in particular has been responsible for that have made it so Black and brown communities and our immigrant populations have been affected in such a disproportionate and devastating way. And so that is calling into question our policies, our priorities and values. And if anything is happening or should be happening in this moment, it is a resetting, a recentering of our values, and government trying to call the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the healthcare world, the education world into that accounting and into that recentering. So powerful and necessary work to do, but the only work there is to do if we mean to come out of this crisis, this triple crisis of racism, of COVID, of economic slowdown. If we're going to come out of this, not only in a more equitable way, but in a way that will signal generational change, we have got to be very serious about the commitments that we are making right now. So that is an invitation, and then an invitation to work collectively, but also, again, rethink what are we saying is most important and when. And so that is why you vote for leaders who will really be about that kind of visioning and that kind of change. So that's a big piece of the role of government, and to also make sure that we can call ourselves into account and be accountable there as well.
We are getting a couple of questions about what we can be doing and what our community can be doing. And let me just preface this question by pointing out that this injustice really runs so contrary to our faith teachings, to Jewish teachings, and to Jewish values. Every Yom Kippur, when we fast, we read from the book of Isaiah and ask ourselves, what kind of fast should we be committing ourselves to? If we should be feeding the hungry, or clothing the naked, or housing the homeless. And so our faith and our tradition commands us that we concern ourselves with this inequality. I think we all wonder and ask ourselves, what can we be doing ourselves, both as individuals and as a community? And maybe if I could ask each of you to comment on that just very briefly, and then I've got some questions in the chat room. And I'll let Karilyn, since you're still on my screen, I'll ask you to begin with that.
So your question is essentially, what can we do, or what should we be doing as community?
What would you suggest that a group out here in the suburbs of Boston, in a faith community, in a congregation, what can we be doing to it, that if we don't, if we're not necessarily in the business or government, what can we be doing to address this racial wealth gap? What can ordinary citizens do, either individually or together?
Well, I think this convening tonight is a pretty beautiful example of trying to lean into the conversation and to let us be in dialogue together. Before you have this incredible panel. I'll exclude myself and point to Segun and Quincy, because these are two brothers that I admire and respect so much, because not only are they saying what needs to be said, but they're willing to do the work. They're willing to show the agency and the power of what it means to call out work and commit to it. And we need people who are willing to do this work with us. And so when you ask what the Temple Elohim could do with us, I would say be in partnership, recognize that we are actually connected. Dr. King talks about this incredible, not only a beloved community, but this idea that we are all interconnected in this phenomenal kind of weaving of a cosmic fabric, that we are more connected than we're not. And I would say, don't believe the lie. Don't believe the lie that race or money or geography separates us. That is more an example of the toxin. To kind of be in fellowship, to be in a trust walk, to be in solidarity with us is actually a very deliberate and dynamic and powerful radical action, which is more true than the other thing.
And let me just ask Segun, since you have challenged people, if you want to just add something to that, and then I'm going to take some questions from the chat room.
Sure. Also will echo what Dr. Crockett said, that she and Quincy have done a marvelous job tonight. And when you put up the recording of this talk, feel free to just X me out. But in terms of what people can be doing, I think it's twofold. So part of it is to the original question about individually. Again, from our perspective at BACMA, it's going to be financially supporting these small businesses. The holiday season is upon us, and so that's going to be particularly important to help our businesses stay alive, because the in-person is not too safe right now. So doing business online will be important. But also, many people here may, either you might run your own business, you might be in a boardroom, you might be part of a C-suite team. You might be either a teacher or professor, or on the parents committee for your school. I mean, everything about who we are and where we are is an opportunity for us to advance the cause of social justice and eliminating, dismantling systemic racism wherever we are. None of our institutions or our cities or towns are blameless in this manner. And so I think it's important that you be the representatives for those of us who cannot be in the rooms, or who have historically been excluded from being in these rooms or at the tables, ensuring that any institution that you're a part of is taking a deep look at itself and ripping itself away from being part of this unjust system, but also finding ways to contribute toward the building of the new world, the beloved community that Dr. Crockett talked about, that Dr. King mentioned so long ago.
We've had a couple of questions in the chat box about reparations. One is that if we're serious about past injustice, let's start with reparations derived
Amen.
from taxes, the distribution to be determined by the Black community. I was actually going to ask Quincy if since I'm trying to move around, but if Quincy might comment whether he agrees with that. And then I think, Segun, you have something to say about it as well.
Yeah, as I could, like, Segun is like holding himself back. I could see that. But, you know, reparations, as everyone knows, has been a topic of conversation for generations. And, you know, so often you hear the sort of counter to this of, well, yeah, but why, but, you know, but why can't, you know, people of color get there just like we got there, right? You hear, and that's really from a place of ignorance. And I mean ignorance from a place of lack of understanding. And so we've really been trying to talk about as it comes to the systems that have been in place that have created this. But, you know, at its basic foundation, it's just, if you just think about it, you know, the moment when slavery was over, and we know there was no moment, but think about back to this generational piece. So, you know, the slaves were given, okay, here you are, you're now free, or so you say, we say you're free, go at it, right? So, but if you're running a race and you're each, you know, and this is, you know, sort of the analogy, right? If you're running a race and one person has a mile start and you both have the exact same abilities, you're never going to catch that other person, right? And that's really what the foundation, I think some of the foundation of the idea of reparations comes from, is it's just not realistic that one person is ever going to catch the other, or one race is ever going to catch the other when they've started with at such a disadvantage. Even if the only way that would happen is if one, you know, was running twice as fast as the other person, and that's just not realistic. So, Segun?
Thank you for that. I did not plant this question, by the way, but thank you to whoever asked it. So how to begin to answer this question about reparations? I guess the first question, or the first answer, is that absolutely it's past time for the nation to commit to and then figure out how to disperse reparations. I mean, the whole, usually the arguments against are, well, we wouldn't know how to identify, et cetera, let's start a commission. Now we need to first say, okay, it is owed as part of the apology and restitution for that. And then we figure out the how. But the other thing is that in the last 2 years, we've had 2 reports that show how our warm embrace of racism has utterly destroyed the economy of the nation. The first is McKinsey and Company came out with a report last August, or August 2019, that said that if we were to close the racial wealth gap today, we would add between $1 and $1.5 trillion to the national economy. So that's one statistic. The way you close it, I would argue, if you were to do that tomorrow, is through reparations. And it can look a number of different ways. It could be this, and it could be exactly what we're calling for in our coalition for the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Fund of investing in housing, purchasing land, growing businesses, et cetera. These are ways to actualize reparations. The other statistic that came out just 2 months ago, actually, August, or a couple months ago, August of 2020, was through Citibank, when they announced that they're starting a $1 billion fund. And part of their report said that due to systemic racism and our warm embrace of racism, America has lost out on $16 trillion in the last 20 years. 20 years, not since 1800s when slavery was over, 20 years. So, you know, and 20 years, well, whatever, it doesn't matter how old I was 20 years ago. But anyway, so point is that, you know, investing in Black communities at the end of the day is investing in the entire nation. You know, thinking of even on the consumer culture aspect of it and capitalism, you know, the fact that Black people have a $1.2 trillion in spending power, which is important because America stays alive through consumer spending. But again, you know, if we are tailored in our approach for reparations and making up for decades and decades, and also present day atrocities against the Black community, then we start to see that the entire nation is thriving. Because again, and I'll just point out, you know, people look at reparations and think we're taking away from and giving to. And while that might be true in the mechanics of reparations, at the end of the day, anytime we've done anything to benefit Black people, the entire nation has benefited. You think of programs like affirmative action that were created in the 60s in order to make up again for or give restitution for what the country had, the harm that they've done to the Black community. Today, it's not simply Black people who are benefiting from affirmative action. It's actually white women and Asian Americans who benefit the most from affirmative action. So again, this is just one example, but when we invest in our communities and we tailor policies that are meant to support Black people and Black communities, it actually winds up being something that everybody benefits from. But when we don't invest in Black communities, when we don't create policies that are directed toward helping Black people and Black communities, it actually harms the entire nation, not just Black people. Racism doesn't just hurt Black people. James Baldwin said, you can throw me in jail, but someone has to be over the jail as well. And so there are two of us really in jail. And so that's why we're, reparations is not something that will harm America, but actually will help sustain and grow the nation.
And I will add, if I may, this is also a topic that is under serious consideration by Mayor Walsh in the city of Boston. And so we've been watching among mayors across the country, Mayor Alorza in Providence, Mayor Manheimer in Asheville, Mayor Haggerty in Evanston, Illinois. There is a sort of movement afoot. And so we have assembled, Mayor Walsh has assembled a roundtable on reparations from about half a dozen mayors who are actively engaged in this conversation. We haven't discussed this publicly yet, but will soon, because the U.S. Conference of Mayors voted unanimously in support of reparations in July of this year. Mayor Walsh did also make that vote. And we know that Representative Jackson Lee has put forward HR 40, and it still is just sitting. It looks like at this time that HR 40, which many of you know is the bill that is pushing for a study on reparations in the United States, is stalled. It would have to be refiled in January or later of 2021. And we want to make sure that mayors around the country are in conversation and offering some leadership to what the federal response can be. And we want Boston to be front and center in that conversation.
I think we have pretty much run out of time. We have a bunch of questions that are left about housing, about difference in the experience of men and women in terms of the racial wealth gap. What advice would we give President-elect Biden to deal with this? I'm going to leave those all for us to ponder. I want to just say thank you on behalf of all of us. I know on behalf of the Racial Justice Initiative and Temple Beth Elohim and Rabbi Sherman. Thank you to Segun. Thank you to Quincy. Thank you to Karilyn, not just for being with us and sharing this evening with us, but really thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm glad that we're finding ways for our community to join you in partnership in this regard. And we will certainly both as a congregation, I think, and in other ways, find ways to support this work. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back to Ediss. I think there's a business meeting coming up, so I will let you, I'll let you share what you need to, Ediss.
Actually, Sherry's going to speak and offer some thanks to you on our behalf.
Ediss was trying to kind of signal me with her, but I didn't.
So thank you so much, Alan, and thank you, panel, Quincy, Karilyn, and Segun. It was a remarkable hour of learning, and we are extremely grateful for your time and the obvious thought you invested in your presentations and the conversation, not to speak of the contributions you make to our communities. We're going to remember Karilyn's words about being in partnership. I'm sure we're going to be back to you. We had a record Zoom turnout for this wonderfully rich program, and I know all of us feel enriched by it. So thank you. Thank you, Alan, for making sure we had the most powerful conversation we could have. And lastly, Thank you to my extraordinary co-chair, Ediss, who comes up with these remarkable ideas and then even more remarkably executes them. It was great, Ediss. So thank you. And now we can turn, as Ediss suggested, to a very brief business meeting. As suggested, we do have some exciting ideas and news, but before I begin with those brief comments, I want to take just a brief opportunity to give a huge public thank you to Nicole Roos. I hope perhaps maybe we could spotlight her. The entire Racial Justice Initiative, advocacy, education, and relationship groups have poured incredible energy into the work of the Combating Voter Suppression campaign of this fall. And over 200, there she is, TBE members volunteered, many of whom are on this call. We ended up sending 18,000 postcards and calling voters in 6 states. The extraordinary effort was led by the graceful, on-the-ground, meticulous organization of Nicole. Nicole, we literally could not have done it without you. Many heart taps and much applause. Your works are your praise. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Actually, thank you to the over 200 people who participated, which was really where all the power was. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks. So as this powerful quarterly meeting suggests, we hope, there are many opportunities to engage in racial economic justice. Ediss and I have started several conversations along these lines. Interesting, exciting conversations that would deliver huge impact. And after some testing here and there with projects, we are ready to formalize this as a Racial Justice Initiative portfolio of work by letting you know that we are recruiting. We are recruiting volunteers for this space. We are looking for potential leaders, for potential organizers, members who play a role in this critical work. If you are curious about what this might mean, if you are looking for a way to make a substantial difference in racial justice, you've heard some of those ways tonight. If you are looking for a very interesting project, please call or email either Ediss or me. We'd love to talk with you. There's a lot of important and engaging work to do. Now for another opportunity. There's good news. There is a very good police accountability reform bill sitting on the governor's desk right now. I have emailed almost all of you about asking you to call the governor to sign it. Remember, we were very passionate about demonstrating after the death of George Floyd, and we were very active about wanting a Black Lives Matter sign. And now it is the time to act legislatively, to act to make sure that this bill that eliminates chokeholds, restricts no-knock warrants, increases transparency, and expands police accountability gets signed into law. Police unions are activated and making their voices heard. We need to do the same. If you have called, thank you. And please make sure that you have recorded the fact that you called on the GBIO link so we can count you. Please inspire one other person in your network to call too. If you haven't called, now is the time. I'm hopeful that we can post the call action sheet on our chat room. Call and don't forget to make sure to record that you did so. So I won't bother you again by calling you. I will be sending around tomorrow the details again.
That's the best way.
What?
It's not going to get in the chat box right now.
Okay,
But we'll
all
send
right.
it out. We'll send it out tomorrow.
We'll send out the action sheet first thing tomorrow morning. I'm happy to report that Rabbi Sapphire was the first to be recorded on our TBE list. This is how change is made, and this is how we live out our intention that Black Lives Matter. On the Black Lives Matter sign front, I'm happy to report that we are close to making final recommendations on an image and a planned post. So stay tuned. But the sign doesn't prompt legislation. Legislative action does. Call the governor tomorrow. Lastly, upcoming events, mark your calendar for our annual TBE Martin Luther King Week beginning January 15th with a special Shabbat featuring the Afro-Semitic Experience Concert, plus another Fresh Food Connection dinner. Stay tuned for more details. Ediss, any final words?
Just to thank everybody for coming tonight and for joining us, I hope in furthering this economic justice initiative, and to thank you all for support of the Trotter School Holiday Gift Drive. Today, Lena Musayev and I sorted over 200 gifts, and we're still accepting gifts and donations and gift cards. So we're set to deliver everything on Monday. Thanks very much. Philip, you're on.
I just wanted to thank everybody for being here tonight. Ediss, Sherry, Alan, thank you for your leadership and wisdom in guiding our conversation. So thank you very much. The last thing that I just wanted to say is we are starting the second cohort of a class called Rescuing Hope, which is a class that is an intergenerational learning experience that's going to meet on Sundays beginning in January with teens and adults. We're going to be exploring the Holocaust, but also looking at anti-Semitism and caste and lots of the different ways that racism played a role during the time of the Holocaust, but also as it is seen today. And so if you are interested in exploring and having these conversations with some teens in our community, please let me know and I can share more information about that program. You'll see it, it's called Rescuing Hope. So I hope you all have a good evening. Is this saying good night?
Good night.
So please join us. Please join us for Hanukkah Thursday night, 7 o'clock. We hope we will see many of you throughout the evenings of Hanukkah over the next week.
Terrific.
Thank you again.
Good night, Gracie.
Thank you.